David is a libertarian theorist and a freelance writer. He's published in many libertarian publications and will be having a book coming out in the near future by a major publishing company, I don't recall the name, on the subject of libertarianism. Among the places where he's published have been the New Guard, the Libertarian Connection, and other periodicals. His first talk for this afternoon will be on population and laissez-faire. David Friedman.
I regard microphones as inventions. Yeah, which is the one that's going to the speaker? I regard microphones as inventions of the devil, and so where it's possible I avoid using them. I think you'll all be able to hear me. This isn't all that large a room. In her talk yesterday, Sharon Presley was arguing for the desirability of tolerating different styles of dress and behavior and such, and I felt that the only trouble was that here we don't really have much opportunity to engage in that toleration, that I don't really know whether it's true, as she seems to think, that the California libertarians have more tolerance for diversity, but I know that they have more diversity to tolerate, and I'm trying to do my little part today to solve that problem. The talk I'm going to give, this talk on population, is a condensation of a 50-page article. I usually outline my talks on part of a 3x5 card. This one is 8.5 by 5, and by a little arithmetic you can figure out that I'll have to talk about 3 times as fast as usual. I'm talking about something where I expect that you will all agree with my conclusion. So what I'm really trying to do is to provide the arguments that I have thought out and that you may need in arguing with people on the issue of population, which happens to be a very live issue this year. My discussion will almost entirely neglect questions of ethics. It is my own prudential opinion that in convincing people of things, ethics is the last and not the first part of the argument, that if somebody believes the policy you want will have catastrophic results, proving to him that he ethically has to do it won't do you any good at all. That once he believes that the policy has good results, then you can persuade him that it's also moral. So the only ethical question that I'll discuss is the question of the implications for population policy of different ethical positions, which is very different from the question of what ethical position is correct. Now, I am not going to discuss the question of what would happen to population in an anarcho-capitalist society. Most of the problems that I am discussing are unquestionably problems that are produced by governmental interventions. It happens, however, that we have governmental interventions. We are going to have them, I very much fear, for the rest of our lifetimes. Maybe I'm too pessimistic. Certainly most of the people who we are trying to persuade not to have the government intervene in deciding how many children you have expect us to have government interventions for the rest of our lifetime and a good deal longer. So I think if we want to argue, given the way the world now is, the government should stay out of the question of having children, we have to argue that in the context of how the world now is. We have to accept, for instance, that whether the government should or shouldn't let the children of the poor starve, it won't. All right, that's a prediction which I make with a great deal of confidence for at least the next 40 or 50 years. And therefore, if we are going to argue that within the present context the market is the proper solution to problems of population, we have to accept the fact that that context includes various things that we, for various reasons and to various degrees, disapprove of. Now, I think in general, brief digression, that it's a cop-out, which a lot of us use a lot of the time, that when you run into a hard problem, you say, but if we only had anarcho-capitalism, that would disappear. We've got to I think there's a limit to a priori argument. To a considerable extent, we have to work in terms of understanding the societies that now exists in order to extrapolate to the societies we would like it to exist. And therefore, we have to, most of the time, when somebody says capitalism is evil, we have to say not, but that's just state capitalism, because most of the time they're wrong. Most of the time it's things where capitalism isn't evil. Even state capitalism isn't evil. And so that you should first discuss things as they are and then get on to the question of how they should be. And I won't get that far in this speech. Now, the essential problem with population, I think, the argument for government control, is that parents, in deciding to have children, can impose the cost of their having children on other people. All right? The basic fundamental argument for the free market depends on the fact that when I make decisions in the market, I bear the costs. If you have a situation where I make decisions and somebody else bears the cost, then there's no reason to believe that letting me freely make the decisions will produce a good result. The argument has been stated rather well by a very able man who's on the wrong side, called Garrett Hardin. He stated it in terms of the tragedy of the commons, which is not a term that he invented. The argument is as follows. You have a piece of common land which all of the people in the village have the right to graze their sheep on, and no one person owns it. Each individual wants to decide how many sheep to graze on that land. As you graze more sheep, the land becomes worse and worse for grazing sheep. All right? I add one extra sheep. The benefit of that is having an extra sheep grazing. I get that. The cost is that everybody who has sheep finds that those sheep are a little bit worse nourished because there's less grass on the common. Now, Hardin says, since I get all of the benefit, the extra sheep, but since I impose most of the cost on the other farmers who are grazing on the common, the result is that I'll keep on increasing the number of sheep I have to the point where all the sheep starve, all right, because I'm imposing the cost on other people. Now, the argument stated that way is, of course, wrong. What is the correct conclusion is I will keep increasing the number of sheep until the commons is so much overgrazed that the damage just done to me by an additional sheep is greater than the value of it. All right? Suppose there are 3 farmers. Every time I add, each with herds of about the same size. Each time I add an additional sheep, I am herding all 3 of us. So I'm taking a third of the herd. So in the case as Hardin describes it, what will happen is I'll keep on adding sheep until things get so bad that the extra sheep does 3 times as much damage as good, and at that point it doesn't even pay me to do it. Now, clearly, we all recognize that the problem in this case is the lack of private property. The problem comes because you have a commons instead of having the land owned by one person who then would bear all the costs and pay and get all the benefits. However, commons do exist. There are some things which are commons in the sense that it's very difficult to define private property in them. And air for breathing is the most obvious example. And there are lots of other things which are effectively commons because of the governmental institutions we have. Obvious example is that the case where a parent has a child and then goes on AFDC, on welfare. That's essentially the commons case. The parent has made the decision to have the child. The parent gets the benefit of having a child in the home, which one assumes the parent values. But a substantial part of the cost ends up being paid by somebody else. All right? Now, the fundamental error, I think, that Hardin makes in his analysis, considered simply as a rational analysis, is of not realizing that it's not an all-or-nothing situation. See, what Hardin says is, as long as there's any commons, you'll increase the herds infinitely, and all the sheep will starve. Whereas what I say is, if you have a commons where I bear a third of the cost of each additional sheep, well, I'll increase it to some point, but not to the point where it doesn't bear any sheep at all. I'll hurt myself a little by doing it. We'll hurt each other a little. If we have a commons where I bear 99% of the cost of my action, then it'll work almost as well as the perfect ideal market system where I bear 100%. So my argument with Hardin's analysis initially is that it didn't occur to him to try to figure out what the division is. If it were the case that when I decide to have a child, 99% of the cost of that decision is borne by the rest of society, all right, in that situation, then there is no rational basis for saying that I'll make the right decision. But if it's the case that 99% of the cost is borne by me and by the child, and we usually assume that parents are reasonably good agents for trying to take care of their children's interests, at least better than anybody else is, then I will, in general, make the right decision. So I really want to discuss several questions. First, I should say, I'm going, in this analysis, to regard the family as a unit. Now, this may or may not be defensible, but I'm going to argue in terms of costs and benefits to the whole family. So I lump together costs and benefits to parents and costs and benefits to children. In my article, I try to separate them out, but that gets enormously more complicated. It's a much more difficult problem, and I couldn't possibly fit that into this discussion. The early drafts of the article you can probably get if you want them. I can tell you where to write for them, and there will be a final draft out eventually. So, the question we want to ask then is, when the members of a family decide to have a child, first question is, how large a fraction of the costs resulting from that decision are borne by them, and how large a cost are imposed in one way or another on other people. All right? In doing this, incidentally, well, wait a minute. The second question we want to ask is, to what extent could that situation be changed within the context of what's now politically feasible? All right? I'm not interested in asking, could we get rid of the problem by abolishing all welfare, because we're not going to. But I am interested in asking, could we get rid of problems which cause difficulties with population by reducing government activity in some way which is possible we might be able to do it? For instance, by substituting loans for direct government subsidies in state universities. One possible example. Now, one mistake which almost all of the liberal writers writing about population make is they only count up half of the situation. You see, I described before a case where I get all the benefit and I only pay part of the cost. But there is, after all, another side to that. There are also situations where I pay all the cost and get only part of the benefit. In the language which some economists use of externalities, a positive externality is the case where what I do benefits other people who I haven't charged for it, who I can't charge for it. That's the free rider case that Murray was misdescribing yesterday. I'll come to that in my next speech. That's a positive externality. A negative externality is the case where my action harms somebody who I have no contractual agreement with. And for some peculiar reason, people who want government to control population only count negative externalities. They never look at situations where my having a child helps other people. And it never occurs to them that you should cancel out. All right? Suppose you're trying to argue the government should regulate my decision to have a child, and you say, well, you do several things so that when you have a child, it costs the rest of us $100. If, in addition, there are other things, other effects which help the rest of you by $100, then on net, I'm bearing all the costs and all the benefits, and there's no case left for government regulation. Now, let me go through the list of the things where people argue that by my having a child, I impose costs on other people. The first argument, which is incorrect, is the argument on fixed resources. People say there's only a certain amount of natural resources, land, I guess those are the main ones, capital, factories and such around. The more people we have, the fewer amount there is per capita. Therefore, when I have a child, I am hurting everybody. Why is that a bad argument? Because those are owned resources. All right? Suppose I own a piece of land. You have more children. All right? The fact that the amount of land per capita for the effect of your having more children is to drive up the price of land. All right? That makes things a little bit worse off for your children who have to buy the land, and a little bit better off for my children who get to sell it, assuming they inherit it. But that does not involve any net injury to the society. All right? The only case where my having more children results in a loss, so to speak, is with regard to my property. All right? All of the property is owned by somebody. Property that I own, assuming it gets divided among my children, the more children I have, the less property each one has. But that's not an external effect. That's an effect which I calculate. And historically, that's been one of the things that people have seriously considered in deciding how many children to have. All right, how many children they can leave enough property so that they think, or how many children they can afford to educate, or in general, how much of their resources it will take to give those children the life they want. There's no external effect at all in that situation as long as all of the resources involved are owned. Now, there's a second case which appears to be an externality and isn't, and I should say that I and all of the other free market economists I discussed this with were very shocked to discover it wasn't an externality because we all thought it was. And that's the case of public school. All right? It certainly appears when you think about it. The government has a public school system. When I decide to have a child, one result of that decision is that the taxes will be used to give that child a schooling. I hesitate to say an education, but a schooling. One should be very careful about words like that, incidentally. Like foreign aid, all right? Foreign aid and aid to education are both very misleading words. My own theory is the government does engage in considerable aid to education. I think the draft is an extremely educational arrangement. But, I mean, the government educates us in lots of ways, but spending money on schools usually isn't one of them. Anyway, but in any case, the government will bear the cost of putting that child through school. So it looks as though I'm simply imposing a cost on the rest of the society by having a child. But that's because you aren't calculating far enough ahead. Because when that child grows up, he is going to have to pay taxes. And the fact that there exists a public school system makes those taxes higher than they otherwise would be. So part of the productivity of that child, part of the productivity of the family, is going not to the family itself, but to the public, the government, the state, the society, whatever you want to call it. So what's happening, if you look at the child's life history, is that he is getting an unearned benefit from the government, or an unearned something. It may not benefit him, but it costs them something anyway. He's getting unearned resources from the government ages 6 to 18, but he is then giving a corresponding amount of unearned resources that he's produced ages 18 to 65. And it turns out, if you work out the analysis, that provided the total expenditure on schooling is increasing roughly at the interest rate, that's the criterion. If that condition is met, on the average, the child will have as much stolen from him, so to speak, as he steals. And therefore, there is no net cost to the society of my having more children. Now, this is a rather complicated and subtle point, and if you want to discuss it in the questions, we can. As I say, I was very shocked by it. My father was very shocked by it. Gary Becker was very shocked by it. But so far, all three of us at least agree that the argument works out to be correct. So those are two cases which appear to be externalities. They appear to be cases where my decision to have a child hurts somebody else, but they aren't. All right. The next kind of externality case is the case where one person is being subsidized to have a child and another person is being anti-subsidized not to have a child, where I can impose the cost of my children on your children, so to speak. Now, a highly typical case of this is the state university. See, the difference between a state university and the public schooling is that everybody virtually everybody goes to the public schools. The remarks I made a bit before aren't quite perfectly true because there are some effects in between people in private and public schools. I was really arguing on the assumption that everyone went to the public schools, which is almost true. So that in the case of the public school, the parent deciding whether to have a child has to figure that on the average his child will pay about as much for the public schools as he gets from them. But in the case of state universities, that's not true. Only roughly half the population goes to universities of any sort, mostly state universities, mostly government universities. That's state colleges and such too. All right? So therefore, if I am a parent who knows that I am in the social class such that my children will get a very expensive subsidized college schooling from the state, I know that on the average my children will pay less in taxes for that schooling than the amount of schooling they get. Because some of the taxes paying for that schooling, quite a large fraction, are being paid by people in the lower social economic classes who don't go to state universities. So therefore, the existence of state universities constitutes a subsidy for the upper classes to have more children. It constitutes a situation in which they are not bearing the cost of their actions. At the same time, it constitutes an anti-subsidy against the lower classes having children. Because when the lower classes have children, those children are going to have to pay the taxes that will pay for the upper classes' university. Now, all right. There's another case, and of course a much better known case of the same phenomenon, and that's welfare. If I am a parent who knows that he's very likely to be on AFDC if he has children, I know that on the average, my children will get much more out of the welfare program than they're going to pay with taxes. So therefore, the welfare program consists of a subsidy for very, very low-income people to have children and an anti-subsidy for everybody else to have children. Now, it's a curious fact, which may have something to do with the sociology of liberalism, that virtually all of the attention in this problem of subsidizing people to have children has gone to the question of subsidizing the poor to have children rather than the question of subsidizing the rich to have children. It turns out, if you work out the numbers, that it is true that per child the poor are getting a larger subsidy to have children than the rich. However, it's also the case that if by the rich we mean the people who are getting the public education subsidy, there are about 5 times as many of them. So it is very far from clear that on net the society is really subsidizing the low-income people to have children and the high-income people not to. It may very well be that it really works out the other way around, just as it works out with very many other government programs the other way around when you look at them carefully. All right. The cases that I've just been describing are cases where one person is hurt and another person helped. There are other cases of externality where there are external benefits which are net benefits or external costs. That is, there are cases when my having a child simply has the effect of injuring other people. It's not that I get something and they lose something. The obvious case there is pollution. Suppose we are in a society which does not have the proper institutions to take care of pollution, which we are. All right? Now, in that case, the more children I have, as far as the pollution effect is concerned, the more pollution they'll do, and that is an uncompensated injury to other people, and therefore they are injured by my having children. Now, of course, the correct solution to that is one should have those institutions which would properly deal with pollution. That, of course, is a sufficient subject for another hour talk. I strongly recommend a book whose final title, I think, was Tannstaffel, by a man called Dolan, who is a free market. He may be an anarchist, I'm not sure, but he's certainly reasonably close to our position, who discusses at some length market solutions to the pollution problem. Tannstaffel, T-A-N-S-T-A-A-F-L, by Dolan. I don't remember his first name. He is not, as far as I know, any relationship to the conservative folk singer. Now, another case with a positive externality and a very large one is national defense. All right? This is something which I usually argue about in a very different context. But consider the following fact. When I have a child, one thing we can predict with absolute certainty, almost absolute certainty, is that he's going to pay taxes for national defense. All right? Sure as death and taxes. The cost of defending the country is independent of the number of people in the country. Almost entirely independent. In some ways, it's cheaper to defend the country the more people are in it, because it's cheaper to recruit an army in a large population country. But as far as most of the defense, as far as nuclear weapons and anti-ballistic missiles and navies and such, you're defending a geographical area. You're not defending a number of people. So therefore, as far as the society as the whole, society is concerned, when I decide to have another child who will be another productive individual who will be another taxpayer, I am imposing no cost at all in national defense, but they're getting something for national defense, namely his taxes. So that in that respect, the externality is a positive one. In that respect, I'm benefiting them by having children. And if there are other respects, like pollution, where I'm harming them, you have to cancel the two in order to get some idea of the overall results. Now, I should say I've done some very rough calculations on what the numbers are. On the question, that is, of what percentage of the cost of bringing up children under present institutions is borne by their parents. I did not include pollution. I know of no practical way of calculating for that, and I'm enough of an optimist to think it likely that that problem will be reduced very substantially in the next decade or two. We can go into that some other time. my very approximate numbers, and they depend on how you do the calculation and all sorts of other things, are that the subsidy to the poor to have children, where by the poor I mean those people whose children are going to be on AFDC for a noticeable fraction of their childhood, about half I estimated, comes out to something around 5 to 16% of the total cost of raising children. That may be an underestimate for various reasons. Those are the numbers that I got. The total percentage of the population affected by that ends up at somewhere around 10%. The total subsidy effect for the rich, for the people who send their kids to state universities, turns out to be around 3%. That affects about 50% of the population. So, anyway, those are very approximate overall numbers. And the conclusion I draw from that is that the whole problem is a tempest in a teapot. That although there doubtless are a few particular parents who are being heavily subsidized, that on the whole, the parents bear most of the cost of having their own children, and that therefore, just from a straightforward market analysis, you get the best results if parents are free to decide for themselves. Now, I should say that there's a lot of nonsense, I think, talked about the whole externality question. People try to argue that there is no problem. There is a problem. There are cases where it's difficult to arrange institutions such that people bear the cost of their own action. The thing you have to remember is that the existence of government's got real big externalities. That if I am convinced that there is some particular little problem that the government will do better than the market, I'm only going to introduce the government if I also think that once I introduce it, it'll stick to that problem. All right? The odds aren't very good on that. So therefore, it seems to me you have to argue that although an externality is, in principle, a valid argument for our being better off with government, it's got to be a pretty big externality before that argument becomes convincing, before it overweighs the factors in the other direction. All right, now, that's the first set of arguments, just an attempt to analyze the problem. Next, what are the suppose you tried to use the arguments I've given against your favorite liberal friends. What are the things they'll come back with? The first thing they'll come back with is, you're talking nonsense. The decision to have children is not an economic decision. It's a decision determined entirely by sociological factors. Since sociologists don't know anything yet, can't really prove that. But if they did know something, they would be able to prove that was what determined it. Now, it's possible that argument could be true. I mean, after all, none of us really claim that human beings are perfectly rational. And if you assume that for some funny reason people are irrational enough about this particular decision, then you might be able to convince me that a political process would be better. But I don't think the evidence is very good. This is a question where the person who's done the original best work on it is Gary Becker, who's a very good young economist at Chicago, whose political views are roughly intermediate between mine and my father's. And he argues that on the evidence of how people behave in having children, it looks as though it is a rational market decision. See, one of the traditional arguments against it being a rational decision goes as follows. Ordinarily, for most market decisions, the richer you are, the more you will consume of anything you consume. All right? The only exception to that is what's called an inferior good. If I'm richer, I will consume fewer Fords because I can afford Cadillacs. But except for the case where there's a better substitute at a higher price, you will normally expect that I will consume more of something, both more quantitatively and higher quality, if I'm richer. And people argue, look, the poor have many more children than the rich, therefore it must not be being determined by economic things. They can't afford it, the rich can. And Becker's answer, which I think he gives considerable evidence for, is the only reason the poor have more children than the rich in this society at this time is that the rich are well informed about birth control and the poor are poorly informed about birth control. That's a temporarily and changing phenomenon. And if you look at situations where you standardize for that, if you look at societies before birth control came along, or if you look at societies, and he gives some examples from Scandinavia, where knowledge about birth control is well distributed throughout all social classes, then it turns out that in fact the rich do tend to have a little bit more children than the poor, essentially because they can't afford it, because the cost of raising children to them is lower than the cost to the poor. The people who argued, there's a very interesting exchange of articles where a woman who's essentially a sociologist argued, no, look, we've got all of these surveys where we ask people how many children they want, and it turns out that the poorer people want more children. Then you look at the surveys. The question is never, how many children would you like to have? I shouldn't say never. There are two exceptions. The question is always, what's a nice number of children to have? Well, what's a nice kind of car to have? It's a Rolls Royce, Mercedes, every time, independent of my income. All right? That's not a question of what you will buy at the actual price. That's a question of what you would like to have. If you look at the 2 or 3 surveys where you ask people not that question, but how many children do you want to have, that is, given the fact that children are very expensive, it then turns out on the figures that this particular lady cited that those studies all show a positive correlation with income. Now, there are a number of other places you can get evidence. For instance, suppose the economic assumption is right and that parents decide to have children basically in terms of their estimate of the total welfare to the children, what kind of a future they see for the children, and in terms of costs and benefits to them of having children, raising them, and so forth. One thing you would expect is that at the bottom of a depression, the birth rate would drop. Why? Bottom of a depression, people are badly off, so therefore they don't want to bear costs, and people are pessimistic. All right, they say the world's terrible, it's going to go on like this forever, who the hell wants to bring kids into a world like this? Very clear observation, birth rate drops catastrophically with the Great Depression. Another thing you would expect would be that as you move from a society where it's easy to use child labor, that is a farm society, towards a society where it's difficult, an urban society, particularly our urban society, as you move from a society where costs of education are low to a society where costs of education are high, that you would expect to observe a falling birth rate. You do. The birth rate in this society has fallen enormously from, say, 1800 to the present. Same pattern in England, same pattern in most of the developed countries. So that it really looks as though people are behaving rationally. They come into circumstances where it no longer pays to have lots of kids, and over a period of time, with some time lag to figure out what's going on, they stop having lots of kids. In fact, it's sort of amusing that all of this sort of furor about being scared of the population has come up in the decade in which the birth rates have been showing an almost unprecedented decline. If you extrapolate what's happened to the birth rate from 1955 to the present, you conclude that we are going to be suffering a falling population sometime in the next century. All right, we're getting fairly close down to replacement now, though we're still a little bit above it, and fertility rates are keep on going down. Anyway, that's sort of a digression. So I think that the argument about economic irrationality, though it's certainly true that the economic man, this guy with the IBM 7090 in his head doing all the calculations, doesn't exist. Nonetheless, people do take into account, to a reasonable degree, costs and benefits in making the decision to have children. All right, next argument that people make is free market decisions are all very well for buying soap. But in the case of buying soap, first you can do the experiment lots of times and find out how you like it. If you make the mistake of buying the wrong brand of soap, the only cost is a dirty shirt. Next week you switch brands. Furthermore, when you make the mistake of buying the wrong soap, you find out about it quick. All right, so you got time to make the decision. So buying soap differs from having children in 2 ways. First, you do it many times, so you're in a position to get lots of good information on it. And second, it involves only short-run calculations. All right, in the case of having children, by the time you find out whether you like bringing up children, it's too late. You've already had all of them. Furthermore, by the time you find out with some confidence what kind of what kind of a world the children are going to live their life in, that's the point when the children are 40 and you're probably senile. So it's long too late at that point to change your mind. That's a perfectly correct argument. The implication of that is people will often make mistakes in having children. That's why there are more unwanted children than unwanted boxes of soap. All right? However, that's an argument for government intervention only if the problem doesn't exist for the government or you've got some reason to think the government is better at solving it. All right? But the government is facing the identical problem. If the government engages in population policies to determine what population we ought to have, it is going to take something between 50 and 100 years before they observe the results of those policies. You've got long, long time lags in these things. In addition to that, the government's only doing the experiment once, too. The government can't set up 73 alternate United Stateses with 73 different policies and see how they work and compare and learn and become good at controlling population. All right? No way of doing that. So therefore, the government is facing precisely the same difficulties as the individual parent. And the government is enormously less suited to deal with them. We've got a good deal of experimental evidence of what the time horizons of government are. All right? The government does plan into the future. It plans, I would say, at least a year into the future and rarely more than 4 years. That's probably a product of our particular political institutions. It is possible that a dictatorship might plan 20 or 30 or 40 years if the dictator had a very sound heart and a very well-organized arrangement, so he was sure he'd be running things that long. I have often speculated that the perfection of economic science, when and if it occurs, will give this country a permanent 4-year business cycle, with the upturn in November of years divisible by 4. All right? So therefore, in doing this calculation, it seems to me what you want to say is not parents are perfect calculators who always make the right decision, but only we have choices among imperfect things done by imperfect human beings. And for this particular problem, we've got good reason to believe, that the parents are in a better position to make the right decision than the government is. The government's much more short-sighted. The government would have to be more long-sighted than the government. It's got to plan for a bit longer than a lifetime, not a bit less. The government would have to be more long-sighted than the parents. In addition, of course, the parents have a much easier problem to solve. From the standpoint of the parent, he doesn't have to worry about all sorts of enormous geopolitical effects. He's just got to worry about his kid and his lifetime, which he can spend some time thinking about, looking at, and so forth. Now, of course, if the government, people will argue, well, the government knows more. The government can afford to hire experts. Fine. Experts are cheap. It's one of the least expensive things the government wastes its money on. If the government wants to hire 17 demographers and publish, the GPO is already eating up forests. They can eat up another tree or two. And publish reports telling parents, this is what we think the world will be like in 50 years, therefore don't have any children. You know, it's too bad. It was a nice tree. But basically, it's not going to do very much harm, and if that will satisfy your liberal friends, fine. The parents can read the paper and decide whether to believe it or not. I've thought that in general it would be a very, very nice sort of intermediate proposal for government quality control, to say that the government has a right to 1 square inch on every package of anything in which they can give their version. And if the manufacturer wants to use the rest of the package to say, here is why the government's telling a lie, that's his business. That's freedom of speech. The government, of course, has to pay the printing costs for their square inch. But if they don't, that's not too important either. All right. So that's, I think, the argument from one side, the analytical argument, so to speak, for the market. I am now going to be redundant. I am now going to prove the same thing from a different direction. The reason I'm going to do that, of course, is that I am not trying to convince you of something because you already believe it, I suspect. I am trying to describe to you the arguments that you're going to need in arguing with people who don't believe it. So I now want to ask not the question, will the market give the right answer, but is the market giving the right answer? If you look at the United States, which is what I've done most of my work for, the problem is more complicated for other countries, is it the case that we are moving towards catastrophe? Because if somebody really believes that allowing people to have as many children as they want is going to cause a catastrophic result, it ain't going to do any good for you to prove that that's the most rational thing to do. All right? They aren't going to feel any better if they starve to death rationally. They are going to conclude there's got to be something wrong with your analysis, whether they know what it is or not. We'd better have the government do something. So therefore, you want to be able to answer the arguments of those people who say, look at what's happening. Look at this world and you see that we are breeding ourselves into catastrophe. And I'm saying that that's not true, that it's absolute nonsense, and that it's observable nonsense, demonstrable nonsense. The assumptions on which the things I'll be saying are based are essentially that population growth follows roughly current trends. What that means approximately is a population of 260 million people in the U.S. by the end of this century, and the U.S. population peaking at something between 300 and 500 million people, after which it might go down, but I'm not figuring that far ahead. There are, it seems to me, 4 basic kinds of catastrophes people are worried about: crowding, starving, pollution, and running out of resources. All right? The crowding one is, I think, emotionally one of the most effective and intellectually one of the worst ones. People say, essentially, look at what the cities are like now. People are crowded together, a terrible way to live. The more people we have, the more crowding. Well, I did a little calculation, which I thought was interesting for this. I took the average population density of Manhattan, not Manhattan, excuse me, of all 5 boroughs of New York, and multiplied it by the area of the United States. 100 billion people. That's a hell of a long way from here. The actual situation, as it seems to me as obvious to anybody who takes time to think about it, is that the reason we have crowding in the cities is not because we have too many people, it's because people want to live under high-density conditions. What that means is that they want to get the benefits of high-density living, restaurants, jobs, because it's more efficient to coordinate people with lots of people in one area, movies, lots of friends around, and so forth. And, of course, they don't want to pay the cost of it, like everybody else and everything. We all want to have our cake and eat it, too. And that it's got very little to do with the total number of people we have in the society, because if people, look, if the people in New York, most of the people in New York who complain about crowding, wanted to live in uncrowded conditions, there are lots of places up in Vermont where you can find land very cheaply. I'm sure you could buy yourself a cabin for less than people pay for rent around here. And you could be out there in the wilderness all by yourself. You'd have no job, probably, or at least you wouldn't get paid very much. The labor situation isn't so good there. You wouldn't have anybody to talk to, a long way to the supermarket. Those are the costs of low-density living. And as a matter of fact, a substantial number of the people who are now in the city are people who came from rural areas because they liked it here better. They were correct. It's better here. And a substantial number of people have moved from here to the suburbs because they wanted lower density conditions. And those were relatively prosperous people who were able to bear the cost of that. They were willing to pay the cost of commuting in and out in order to have those low-density conditions. So the point is that there's lots and lots and lots of land to live on. That just is not what we're running out of. Second version is the starving one, where people say, yes, but how can we feed all those people? Well, that's sort of a strange question in this country because our usual problem is crop surpluses. If you actually look at sort of how agriculture works, it's quite clear, first, that we are not producing nearly as much produce per acre as we could. Japan, for instance, where they've got much, much greater scarcity of land, produces a much higher yield per acre than we do. They do it by spending more money growing food. They divert resources from other things into that. Furthermore, this society chooses to eat a diet which is very expensive in terms of the land it uses. That is to say, we get most of our protein from meat, which happens to be a very inefficient way of producing protein. You've got to first produce the plants, and then the plants get turned into protein by the animal. Nothing wrong with that. It's one of the things you do when you're rich, is to have expensive things. But if it turned out that you had enough population pressure on food so that the cost of land went really up, so that we were really sort of using all the farmland we could find, that would give people a greater incentive to make food out of soybeans, which they're doing a good deal already. They usually don't tell you about it, but they do it. And to use wheat protein and all sorts of other things, and to slightly alter the form in which our food is produced in such a way as to give you essentially the same diet at maybe a slightly higher cost for a substantially larger number of people. See, the thing you have to remember in general, the thing which we all ought to be conscious of but most other people aren't, is that markets are enormously flexible. There are 1,000,001 ways of doing anything, and that the particular ways that it gets done are a result of the particular market circumstances. You got lots of land and not too many people who want food, so you use the land in a way which doesn't produce enormous yields per acre. Well, if people are willing to pay twice as much for the food, then you use up all the land and you use slightly more expensive forms of production. So that population in general, this applies not just to food, poses a problem only if you have something where the cost of producing more of it, the cost of raising the production, is a large fraction of the per capita income. So that it really starts cutting down on what we got for other things. Now, in the case of food, unfortunately, I don't have my actual numbers here. I turned out the copy of my article I brought with me has got some pages missing for various reasons, including that one. As I remember, it turns out that each individual in this society pays about $200 a year towards the cost of the raw material for food. But processing costs, presumably, there's no problem in increasing more. You just build more factories, it costs the same amount per unit. So therefore, if that went up to $220 or $250 over the next 50 years, that does not represent any substantial decrease in people's standard of living. And it seems to me that if you increase the price you're paying for something by 20 or 30 or 40 or 50%, anything of that sort, you would have no difficulty in providing the additional food. All right. The third one is pollution. Brief preview. Dolan's solution to pollution, of course, is to force polluters to pay the cost of the pollution they're doing. Now, a question people may reasonably ask here is, how expensive is that? If it, for instance, one form of pollution is breathing. All right? Consumes oxygen, produces carbon dioxide. Oxygen is more useful than carbon dioxide. It's pollution. If it turned out that the cost of controlling pollution by imposing the cost of pollution on the polluters was $20,000 a head for breathing, it wouldn't be a very useful solution. Most of us would have to stop breathing. It isn't. If you look at the amount presently being spent for controlling pollution, it's a very, very, very tiny fraction of total income. I think it's, I don't know, probably under 1%. I'm not sure. Again, I have the numbers, but it's somewhere around there. So again, if you're willing to pay twice as much or 3 times as much, and again, we're talking about an increase over a period of 20 or 30 years, there should be no difficulty in, while your population goes from 200 to 250 million, increasing the efficiency of your control of pollution by the 20 or 30% necessary to make pollution fall a little while population is rising. Now again, I'm not going to go into the question of how you control pollution. For that, you can read Dolan's book. All right, the last problem is running out of resources. I said before that that's not an externality problem because they're privately owned. Nonetheless, it is a problem you can ask about. You can say, is it the case that as populations are increasing, we're going to find that we don't have any resources? We've used it all up. Now, first, conceptually, you have to remember that most resources cannot be used up. There is no way of using up a piece of iron. I exaggerate very slightly. You can put it at the end of an accelerator with elementary particles coming out, and maybe you can get a transmutation and change iron into something else. But that's not what we normally do in the course of our daily lives. What we do with iron is to transform it from more useful to less useful forms. And then the steel mill picks it up and transfers it into more useful forms. All right? That's what's called recycling. So you cannot run out of resources in the sense of using them up. The only question you can, there are several questions you can ask. The first question is, as the amount of the resources you are using, not consuming, each day increases, the percentage that has to be produced by recycling goes up. You've got to reuse the same stuff rather than digging up ore. That's somewhat more expensive. Is that a large cost? No. How do I know it's not a large cost? Iron is presently 50% recycled under present prices, present economic circumstances. So it can't be terribly expensive to recycle. Second, it turns out that the total cost borne by people in this society for raw materials is, if I remember my numbers correct, and again, this is memory, something like $30 a head per year. All right. I cannot believe that if you doubled the price of iron, tripled the price of iron, quadrupled the price of iron, you wouldn't be able to go from 50% recycling to 98% recycling. And yet that involves decreasing my income 30 years from now by $100. That's if you do that for all raw resources. Iron is just a little tiny one. All right. So therefore, again, it appears to me, just if you look at it quantitatively, that in this country, for the next century or so, the problem doesn't exist. Now, there is another interesting question you can ask, and that question is not how much iron do we consume, but how much iron are we using at any given instant? All right? You can't recycle my car. I'm driving it. All right? So you could ask the question, how much of each resource is actually physically tied up in use in our civilization as it now exists for each person? As far as I know, nobody has ever done these calculations in general. I did them for iron when I was doing this research because I thought I was curious, interesting question. And the conclusion I reached, very approximately, was that presently known reserves of iron ore, that's including both those that it presently pays to mine and those that we know are there but aren't good enough grade to be worth mining now, will provide a sufficient amount of iron to maintain enough iron in existence to provide a U.S. standard of living for 40 billion people. Now, that's a rather pessimistic calculation because, after all, we might find more iron. But I really do not expect in the near future that the world will have a 40 billion population all living at U.S. standard of living. So it therefore appears to me that, at least as far as iron is concerned, and iron is, I suspect, probably the metal, at least, which we use in largest quantities, that the total amount available will take care of us very comfortably for quite a long time. Now, there is, of course, one resource you can consume. That's entropy. Forgive me for using technical words. Think of it usefully as fuel. It's not energy. You can't consume energy. All right? When you take gas and burn it in your car and get power from that, you aren't using up that power. It's just going into heat. I mean, I don't want to give a course in physics. In principle, when you burn that gas, you could put it back together again. If you had a good enough organic chemist, you could take all the things that came out and put it back together. But in doing that, he'd have to use up power. That is to say, he'd have to use that, transform that power from useful to non-useful forms. And that, unfortunately, is not a reversible process. That's something called the law of increase of entropy. So therefore, the one thing which we do use up is fuel, power sources. And the question you can then ask is, if you assume that world use of power increases at roughly the rate it's been increasing, which is about 4% a year, how long will what we have last? Answer is the fossil fuels, coal and oil, will last well into the next century. At present levels of use, we have something like 100, 200 years, 200, I think, years left of them, but of course we'll be increasing the use. But sometime in the mid-21st century. Uranium and deuterium, uranium and plutonium we can now use for fission reactions, are quite a lot more than that. Deuterium for fusion reactions, which everybody is guessing we will have sometime in the next 50 years, is lots more than that. All of those things get exhausted. All right, we've got the sun up there. It's putting out lots of power. Roughly speaking, if you keep on that 4% growth rate, keep on extrapolating it, in about 300 years we will be consuming all the power incident on the Earth from the sun. There's no reason in principle why you can't tap all of that. That's a technological problem. It's not a very difficult technological problem, given you've got lots of time and resources and so forth. Of course, there's no reason we should limit ourselves to the light falling on the sun. I mean, look at all that light that's being wasted just going out into outer space. So if you take the limit, which is the total output of the sun, and again, that, it appears to me, is a technological problem, which should be perfectly solvable in a few hundred years. You know, you put a spherical mirror around the sun at some reasonably large radius so it doesn't burn up, and you have sufficient apparatus to turn that into usable power. In 800 years, we're going to run out. And so in 700 years, I'll start worrying about it. So I just want to warn you that in about 800 years, we're going to have to stop having more children. By more, I mean too many. You can still have replacement rate. We can still live off the sun as long as it lasts, which is going to be a while. But we can't keep on increasing our power consumption unless we figure out a new gimmick, and I can't think of any really good ones. Might be able to speed up the sun somehow, but I can't see any way of doing that. So in about 800 years, we're going to have some problems. All right. Let's see. Yeah. One brief point on recycling, just sort of experimentally, for the people who are going to tell you, well, the market won't do that. We've got lots and lots of practical experience. There are presently resources which are expensive, which are valuable, and therefore are recycled. Silver is the clearest example. I don't know if you know it. One of the major uses for silver is in photographic film. In the developing process, they get back a large fraction of that silver. Right? That's a very laborious, difficult kind of recycling to every time you develop a film, in effect, to try to take as much of the silver as you can out of the film. And yet they do that. Why do they do that? Silver's expensive. So that one thing that it seems to me you should be able to produce the arguments for by yourselves with no difficulty at all, just straightforward market analysis, is that when you run into shortages of natural resources, when things get expensive, people start recycling. Don't have to have the government to tell them to do that. Yeah, I'm almost near. I'm near the end if I drop two of the three next things I was going to say, which I had as things I might drop anyway. The one other thing I want to say is my one little bit on ethics, and that is that the way people view the population problem is in itself partly a consequence of their ethical position. If you talk to ordinary liberals, that is most of the people you'll talk to, about the population problem, they are very upset over the question of whether various things you could do about population are or are not coercive. All right? They say, well, is it coercive? Yeah, surely it's coercive if the government tells you how many children to have. But they say it's also coercive if the government refuses to give welfare to welfare mothers who have too many children, because after all, that really, that's terrible to make people starve. And so the point I want to make is only that within the liberal ethic, there is an inevitable, unavoidable problem of coercion and controlling population. Because the liberal I want to define between a liberal and a libertarian ethic, very briefly. A liberal ethic basically judges by results. It's judged basically on the idea that people are not primarily responsible for what happens to them. That although they may affect it a little bit, it's mainly things outside themselves. That therefore, the only thing you can say is this guy hungry or isn't he hungry? Not, did he earn his food or didn't he earn his food? Nobody earns anything since they don't really control what happens to them. That's the basis of it. Well, in terms of that ethic, anytime you give anybody a good reason for doing anything, you're coercing him. All right, think it out. I'm doing this briefly. But that's the case. There is no grounds for distinguishing between coercion in our sense and coercion in the sense of saying you must bear the consequences of action. Right? In terms of the libertarian ethic, the distinction is very simple. All right, you're responsible for what happens to you. It may be very bad that you have to live on lard and beans because you had too many children. Maybe it would be nice if some of us would get together and help you and do something about it. But you aren't being coerced because of that. You're merely bearing the costs of reality. If anybody's coercing you, reality's coercing you. All right? You're being coerced by the fact that in reality, you got to produce things before you consume them. And the only way you can avoid that coercion is to transfer it to somebody else. All right. If people are interested in the article, I can give them the address of the people I'm writing it for who will probably send free copies. If people want to ask questions, I don't know if there's time for that or not. But anyway, thank you.